Now we're going to talk about outlaws in the Old West. Now, to be fair, our previous section about gunfighters, quite a few of those guys technically were outlaws because they were wanted by the authorities at various times for one killing or another. But if you noticed, in most of those cases, those killings were when two people didn't like each other or one felt dishonored by another, and there was a gunfight. Usually not done in the commission of some other crime. So what we're looking at here, mostly, not in every case, but most of the cases we're going to look at, these are people who were professional criminals. And we're going to start with a couple of solo acts, if you will, beginning with Charles E. Bolton, alias Black Bart. He operated completely alone. This is a picture of him when he was a little bit younger, when he started robbing things. He was in his late 40s, was active until he was in his late 50s. He chose his own name, Black Bart, because Black Bart was a famous Welsh pirate in the 1700s, which shows you that Charles E. Bolton was well read, and indeed he was. He was born in England, and as a toddler, his family immigrated to the United States to New York, and he served in the Civil War. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. When he was around 20 in 1849, he headed west to California during the gold rush with his two brothers, both of whom died of disease while they were out there. He spent a few years in California, then he went back east, wound up living in Illinois for a while, and that's when he served in the Civil War with quite a bit of distinction, actually. He was promoted a couple of times, eventually becoming getting field promotion to first lieutenant. He was apparently pretty good at his job. When the war was over, he well, he was married, and one day he just left, and his wife never saw him again, and he went back out west to California. Um, she did hear back from him after he had gotten there, sometime in the early to mid 1870s. He sent a letter back home saying that he had been horribly mistreated by some Wells Fargo agents, and that he implied that he was going to do something to get them back. And then she never really heard from him, much if at all, after that. What happened afterwards is that Charles Bolton, who lived in San Francisco, started he started robbing stagecoaches, specifically Wells Fargo. He robbed 28 stagecoaches in an 8-year period between 1875 and 1883, mostly along this trail on the West Coast from San Francisco up to Portland, Oregon. And everybody he robbed was always Wells Fargo. He, like I said, he was a little bit older than in this picture. This is a picture of him from couple of pictures from 1888. He was very dapper. He dressed very sharply, even as an outlaw. He wore a derby hat and a long coat, sometimes carried a cane, always carried a shotgun. And when he would rob the stagecoaches, he would put a flour sack over his head with eye holes cut into it as a mask. And he was, he stood out. He stood out among highwaymen, at which he also turned out to be very good at that job. He made thousands of dollars per year during that time period, but he stood out because he was extraordinarily polite. Polite and genteel, never swore except sometimes in the messages he left behind. And he left messages that included, on a couple of occasions, poems. And he actually only left two poems out of 28 robberies, but those two poems were enough to cement his legend. One, you can see them both here. Here I lay me down to sleep to wait the coming morrow, perhaps success, perhaps defeat, and everlasting sorrow. Yet come what will, I'll try at once, my condition can't be worse. And if there's money in that box, 'tis money in my purse. And then the second one was a little more to the point. I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor, and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches. So anyway, yeah, I don't know what the Wells Fargo people did to him, but it really ticked him off. However, in all those 28 robberies over 8 years, he never once fired that shotgun. He also robbed the stagecoaches on foot. He would just show up in the middle of the road, and then he would escape on foot. And that's because he couldn't ride a horse because he was afraid of them. He had been in the infantry, not the cavalry. Anyhow, on his 28th robbery, things went wrong, and one of the stagecoach guards, one of the Wells Fargo guys, got off a shot at him and hit him in the hand. And so he escaped into the brush. He took out his handkerchief, his fine handkerchief, and used it to try to stop the bleeding, and left the handkerchief behind. And that was his undoing, because the laundry mark was on it from a laundry in San Francisco. So the Wells Fargo agents were able to go to San Francisco and find that laundry and match up that mark, the number on it, to find out whose handkerchief it was. And Black Bart was arrested and charged with all these robberies. And what he did was confessed to the first few robberies because the statute of limitations had expired on them, but he didn't confess to any of the others. However, they had him dead to rights on the 28th one, and that's the one that they convicted him for, sent him to prison, and perhaps due to his advanced age, perhaps due to his good behavior and genteel nature, he didn't spend very much time in prison, and he was released in 1888. Still, I mean, he was around 60 years old at that time, and went back to San Francisco, and no one ever heard of him again. Although there were robberies, stagecoach robberies, that had poems, but those were copycats. We know this because they had misspelled words in them, which he would never have done. And they had poor meter in the poetry. So that's the story of Black Bart. Now we're going to talk about this guy, Haske Benetentile, or the Apache Kid, which is what I'll call him from here on out. The Apache Kid was, in fact, Apache. He was, in fact, Western Apache. He was born somewhere around 1860, just south of the present-day San Carlos Apache Reservation, which you can see the territory there. He was San Carlos, and he also may have been related to the White Mountain Apache. When he was a child, he was captured by Yuma Indians from out there in western Arizona on a raid, and was a captive for several years until a U.S. cavalry raid on the Yumas freed him from them. He gained his freedom there, and he wound up being sort of under the wing of Al Siebers, who was a German immigrant who had risen to become the chief of scouts in the U.S. Army in the Apache Wars. So Siebers took him under his wing, and by the time that the kid was about 21 years old, he became an Apache scout. himself. He officially joined the U.S. Army, and here he is around the time he joined, 1881. And here he is around the time he joined, 1881, with some of his fellow scouts. And then eventually he rose actually to the rank of sergeant among the Apache scouts. He was pretty good at his job. The Apache scouts, by the way, in the U.S. cavalry, in case you didn't know or if I didn't mention it before, those were Apaches that were recruited as scouts to help track down other Apaches, those Apaches who were still fighting, like Geronimo and Victorio, also used against other southwestern tribes when the U.S. Army was at war with them. The Apaches that were in these scouting units might have come from any group, but quite a few, not all, maybe a majority of them were from the more western bands like the White Mountain Apaches. But they came from all the different Apache bands. So far, the Apache Kid doesn't sound much like an outlaw, does he? In fact, the Apache Kid here is one of the people I'll talk about in this lecture that I kind of hinted at earlier, that not everybody I talk about is a professional career criminal. However, he is going to become a fugitive, and he is going to be repeatedly accused of criminal acts. It all started in 1887, at which point he had been an Apache scout for the U.S. Army for about 6 years. The chief of scouts, Al Siebers, left San Carlos with a cavalry troop, and the Apache Kid was left in charge of the scouts while he was gone until the troop got back from, I'm assuming, probably a patrol or something. And the scouts, the Apache scouts, decided to have a party, and there was some very heavy drinking that went on, and many of them were inebriated, and a fight broke out that turned deadly, kind of a melee between two different groups of Apaches. And in this fight, the Apache Kid's father was killed. One of the Apache Kid's friends killed the guy that killed his father, and then he killed the brother of the guy that had killed his father, and just a bunch of people got killed, basically. And when the soldiers returned, several of the participating Apaches were arrested, including the Apache Kid. And as they were being essentially rounded up by the soldiers, there was a crowd of onlookers, and someone in the crowd fired a shot, and then more people in the crowd fired shots toward the arrested Apaches. Now, it could have been friends or relatives of the Apaches on the other side who'd gotten killed, possibly in this fight. Anyhow, Al Siebers is the person that got shot in the foot, so it wasn't a life-threatening injury. But the Apache Kid and several others, while coming under fire from the crowd, made it to horseback and escaped. So they escaped, and they avoided for a while the patrols that were after them. The Kid sent word back that he would come in and surrender if they would call off the patrols, basically, I guess, not shoot him on sight. So he did come in, and he and 4 other Apaches, 5 in all, were convicted of not just the killings, but of mutiny and desertion, and were sentenced to death by firing squad. Well, a month later, that was commuted to life in prison. And then shortly after that, General Nelson Miles, who was the commanding general there, took it down even further to 10 years in prison. So they were sent to prison, and they were there for about a year because their case was overturned on appeal, and they were released. However, there was a huge outcry among the Apaches that didn't like them about them being released. So new warrants were issued, and they were arrested again and tried again and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Well, they were being transported by wagon to the prison. There was the stagecoach driver, and there were 2 sheriffs that were acting as guards. And along the way, the Apache prisoners, were able to overwhelm the guards and actually killed the guards, shot the guards, and then the driver also got shot. But he wasn't killed, and according to him, the Apache Kid stepped in to prevent him from being killed. He suspected because he had been kind to the kid and to the other Apaches, giving them cigarettes and stuff. Anyway, the Apache prisoners took off, and from that point forward, the Apache Kid was a fugitive. The other Apaches were all captured eventually and brought back, but he was not. And he kind of became almost like not an urban myth, a rural myth, a bit of a legend over the next several years as Army patrols were repeatedly sent into the area whenever there was a reported sighting of him to try to capture him. There were accusations that he rustled some cattle from local ranches, and every so often there'd be reports that an Apache had been killed or found dead, and that was the Apache Kid, but it never was. The last known sighting of him was in 1894, but people were continuing to claim they had seen him in operation in the Southwest all the way into the 1920s. And there were reports of his demise, like I said, every couple of years. And this is where, in an interesting twist, this guy becomes tangentially a part of the story. A young cavalry trooper in the 7th Cavalry. This is in 1895, 96. So that's about, he would have had a really hard time of it if he'd been in the 7th Cavalry 20 years before that, because that's when the Custer thing happened. But this is in the 1890s. A young trooper named Edgar Rice Burroughs. He was in the 7th Cavalry stationed in the Southwest for a couple of years, from 1895 to 1897. And during that time, he was on many of these patrols that were trying unsuccessfully to track down the Apache Kid. What finally became of the kid, nobody really knows. However, he did, well, at least his name, live on, sometimes as characters in movies and TV shows, or in this comic book from the 1950s. He was a Marvel character back when they were called Atlas, and as you can see, the only thing similar is the name. The character itself is supposed to be one of the many quote-unquote white Indians. That was a big thing back then in comics. It doesn't even look like an Apache, but his name has lived on. Now we're going to take a look at outlaw gangs. You know, safety in numbers, as they say. And I picked this picture because this is a good photo of a gang. And we got one famous person in there, Sam Bass. This is him in his younger years. And I say that he didn't really live to his older years. But here he is a little bit younger. And here is the prerequisite mustachioed portrait. It's hard to be a Western legend if you don't have a mustachioed portrait. Now, it would be more accurate to say that both of these images are images purported to be Sam Bass. We actually have no verification that either of these are actually pictures of Sam Bass, but they've been used as such for a very long time. In fact, the picture that was on Sam Bass's wanted poster was not a picture of him. We can't prove that there's any pictures of him. Anyway, let's talk about Sam Bass. He's from Illinois, born in 1851. Orphaned at a young age, raised by an uncle. At age 19, he left home and went down to Texas, where he became a cowboy and went on several cattle drives, which he found to be not the most fulfilling line of work, nor the most remunerative. He got into horse racing for a while, had a pretty good horse, but then the horse got old, and so that kind of left him out. So what he eventually wound up doing was got together with some friends and robbed a train. They robbed a train in Big Springs, Nebraska, a train that was carrying a whole lot of gold from San Francisco back east. In fact, they netted $60,000, which to this day is the largest haul of any train robbery in history. So they did that, and then they split up, make it harder to catch them, and went their separate ways. As far as I know, didn't ever hook back up again. Bass took his share and went back down to Texas and raised up a new gang. And this potentially he had a really great haul, so that had potential for making some money. Never made another haul like that again. Most of the robberies that he did, he got like $4,000 or $5,000, which was still a whole lot of money back then. Anyway, he and his gang robbed 2 stagecoaches and 4 trains, all within a 25-mile radius of Dallas where they were staying, which probably not the best idea, because that kind of narrows it down, doesn't it? The Pinkerton Detective Agency was brought on the case by the railroad company, and they started hunting them down. Now, it didn't help that they had the wrong picture on the wanted poster, but they did manage to get through to one of the members of Bass's gang and got him to become an informant. And the way they did that was that they'd arrested his father, and so kind of as leverage. So he did become a spy for them inside the gang. And this is how they knew that the Bass gang was about to graduate to bank robbery. So they were going to rob a bank in Texas, but they knew they were coming, and that's never a good thing. They were sighted, and some Texas Rangers were there waiting for them, so they had the Texas Rangers and the Pinkertons on their trail. And a gunfight ensued. 1 or 2 members of the gang were killed on the spot. Bass was grievously wounded, but made his escape, but not too far. He wound up lying in a field, bleeding out, when the posse rode right past him. They didn't even see him in the tall grass, and he managed to sit up and say, "Hey, I'm over here." So they arrested him, but he died the next day from his wounds on his 27th birthday. Now, maybe you've never heard of Sam Bass. That's probably why. He had a very short career. I think this whole robbery thing, from the Nebraska train robbery to his Waterloo, was about 9 months. Sam Bass and his gang, as successful as that first train robbery was, were amateurs compared to some of the other gangs we're going to look at, particularly the one we're going to look at next, the James Younger Gang. And really, everybody was amateurs compared to them. They became extremely famous for about a 10-year period in the late 1860s, actually a little bit longer than that, to the early 1880s, during which time they robbed banks and trains, once robbed the fair in Kansas City, robbed places in 11 different states. Of course, the James Younger Gang is so named because it was led by the James brothers, Jesse and his older brother Frank, and also the Younger brothers, whom you can see here. The Jameses and the Youngers were related by marriage. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as cousins, and in a way they were, but not by blood. Here is a picture of the older younger brothers and their younger sister Henrietta. By the way, the Jameses and the Youngers, all these brothers were born in western Missouri, in an area, a part of Missouri that's called Little Dixie, because most of the people who settled there were from Tennessee or Kentucky, or in some cases Virginia or North Carolina. You can see the darker the county is, the higher the concentration, and the more they're associated with Little Dixie. They were in the westernmost part. The James brothers, born and raised in Clay County, you see there, and the Youngers were from Jackson County, which is directly south of Clay County, so not too far apart. I'm sure you remember our discussion many lecture videos back about Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s and the anti-slavery people that came into Kansas from non-slave states, and then the pro-slavery people that came in, many of them from Missouri. And a lot of the violence was along the Kansas and Missouri border. So factor that in, realizing that Missouri was a slave state, one of a handful of slave states that did not secede, but nonetheless there was a lot of strong Confederate sympathy in the state, and a lot of people from Missouri joined the Confederate Army, just as quite a few also joined the Union Army. But if you bear in mind that this little strip of land is called Little Dixie and was settled by Southerners, then it should come as no surprise to learn that the pro-Confederate sympathy was very strong there. And in fact, the parents of Frank and Jesse James, especially their mother, was very pro-Confederate. The father of the Youngers was actually pro-Union, but that didn't stop the Union soldier from killing him in 1862 when he was on a business trip, which led his sons to have very different sympathies than he had had. In fact, the Jameses and the Youngers, at least some of them, were going to be associated with guerrilla activity, Confederate guerrilla activity during the war. You will also remember, I hope, from way back in lecture 37, our discussion about these guys, William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, Confederate guerrilla leaders operating out of Missouri, often operating together. In fact, a lot of smaller bands often came together under the overall command of Quantrill. Cole Younger joined Quantrill's Raiders early in the war, and then Frank James joined as well. Cole was present at the sack of Lawrence, Kansas by Quantrill's Raiders in 1863. Frank may have been. Then, let's talk a little bit about this guy as well. He was a lieutenant of Bloody Bill Anderson. His name was Archie Clement, or Arch Clements, also from Missouri. Reputed to be, had the reputation of being as violent as Bloody Bill. And if you remember, Bloody Bill scalped people. You will also, I hope, remember the situation in that jail where the families of several guerrillas were arrested, mostly women, and the jail mysteriously collapsed on them, and Bloody Bill's sister was killed, which really fueled his desire for revenge. Three of the younger sisters were in that jail collapse as well. They weren't killed, but they were grievously injured. Now, eventually, Jim Younger also joined Quantrill's Raiders, and in 1864, at the age of 16, Frank's younger brother Jesse joined up. Here he is in his Confederate finery as a teenager, and he and Frank wound up serving with Bloody Bill Anderson, and in particular after the deaths of Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson with Arch Clements. Jim Younger was wounded in the same attack in which Quantrill was killed, and he was captured. Jim Younger was captured and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp till the war ended and he was released. You may also remember from lecture video number 37, General Order number 11, which is when the Union Army declared martial law in 4 western Missouri counties, including Jackson County, where the Youngers' families were, because of the strong Confederate sympathies in these counties, which were along the Kansas border, due to the fact that the federal authorities felt that the people in the counties were giving aid and comfort to the guerrillas, and they were. So martial law was declared, and in the rural areas of these counties, which is most of them, if you were going to remain in the county, you had to prove your loyalty to the Union, otherwise you had to leave. And even if you took the oath of loyalty and had a past history of pro-Union sentiment, even then you were allowed to stay in the county, but not in your home. People were put into camps where the Union soldiers could keep an eye on them. So this affected a lot of people. And the idea was to dry up support for the guerrillas, but in reality, it only increased support for the Confederate guerrillas and made them angrier. Now, by the end of the war, as I mentioned, Quantrill and Anderson had both been killed. Arch Clement was still active, and Jesse and Frank James were riding with him. And when the surrender happened at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, Clement's group of guerrillas did not surrender and turn in their weapons. In fact, they remained active. And shortly after that, Clement's group ran into a Union militia patrol, and Jesse James said that he tried to surrender, came forward to surrender, and was shot down. He took a bullet to the chest, in fact, almost killed him. It took him a long time, months, to recover from that. Clement, however, escaped, and a few months later, on February the 13th, 1866, Arch Clement and his group of still active, now former, I guess, Confederate guerrillas, went to Clay County, which is where the Jameses were from, and robbed the Clay County Bank. And this was the first ever bank robbery done in broad daylight while the bank was open. We don't know exactly who was with Clement, but it's suspected that Cole Younger may well have been. Frank James might have been. But for sure, this is the group they were associated with. And after that, they continued along that trajectory, basically robbing and pillaging any area that was pro-Union, pro-U.S. as opposed to the Confederacy, even though the war was over. And within a few months, Clement's group was found, and there was a big gunfight, and Arch Clement was killed In fact, he died. He expired after having been wounded multiple times, trying to cock his gun with his teeth. So that was the end of Arch Clement. But within a few months after that, in 1868, there was another bank robbery in broad daylight in Kentucky. And we do know for a fact that Cole Younger was in that group, and Frank James might have been. So by that time, or shortly after, Jesse James, now recovered, was riding along with his brother Frank in this outlaw gang that had sort of morphed from a group of Confederate guerrillas into a group of essentially professional bank robbers. And then, over time, the other younger brothers, the other three, became members of this gang as well. Jesse James came to public notoriety in 1869 when, during a bank robbery in Missouri by the now James and Younger gang, he shot the cashier. Not because he had, tried to alert anybody, or not because he had drawn a gun, but rather because Jesse James mistook him for somebody else. Thought that he recognized him from the group of people who had killed Bloody Bill Anderson, so he shot him down. This made the papers in a big way, and before long, the James Younger gang was making the papers regularly because they were pretty active, and they did have some level of support among pro-Confederate people in Missouri. However, as we've discussed before, there was also by the mid 1870s, early to mid 1870s, there was a pretty strong reaction, anti-Gilded Age reaction among farmers in Kansas, Missouri, and elsewhere, and so they were plenty happy to see the banks and the trains getting robbed because they didn't like bankers and railroads. Now, the idea that Jesse James was a Robin Hood-like figure who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, that kind of grew after his death, particularly in the 1890s during the populist era, when he was sort of grabbed onto as a populist hero. Now, there's no evidence that Jesse James or any of the other people in his gang ever took the money that they robbed and gave it away to poor people. However, there is evidence, it is a fact, that in most cases when they robbed trains, except for a couple of times, when they robbed trains, they only robbed the safe. A lot of times these trains would be transporting money or gold. They did not rob the passengers on the train, which most train robbers did. So maybe that little bit of it has some seed of truth to it. But overall, if you got in their way, they'd shoot you. It didn't matter what side you'd been on in the war. They were a very dangerous group. The James Younger gang robbed several trains in 1873 and 74, several in Missouri and up into Kansas and in Iowa. In fact, the Kansas one, they netted $30,000, which was a pretty big haul. Turns out that railroad companies don't like being robbed. Also, railroad companies had a lot of money. So, the railroad companies hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, headed up by Alan Pinkerton. We've mentioned the Pinkertons before, but a little bit of background about how they came to be. Alan Pinkerton was a Scottish immigrant. He had moved to the United States when he was 23, wound up in Chicago, and actually wound up eventually by 1849 becoming the first police detective in Chicago. And shortly after that, with a partner, founded a private detective agency which eventually came to be known as Pinkerton National Detective Agency. You can see they had their own badges, and they also had a motto, "We never sleep." By the way, the Pinkerton Agency is still around. Today, they market themselves as a independent security contracting company. Anyway, by the time the Civil War came around, Pinkerton's agency was pretty well established, and in fact offered their services to the U.S. government and the Union Army. Here you can see Pinkerton with Abraham Lincoln. They actually were engaged by the Justice Department, and they also provided intelligence, gathered information for the Union Army during the war. Also, Pinkerton foiled an assassination plot against President Lincoln very early in the war. Well, after the Civil War, the Pinkertons were primarily known as strike busters. A lot of times they would send operatives in as private security for factory owners and mine owners to beat up and disperse striking workers. And every once in a while they would send in undercover operatives to infiltrate unions. For example, the Irish group, the Molly Maguires, coal miners in Pennsylvania that committed several murders, were infiltrated by a Pinkerton agent. Now, in the 1870s, I think probably as early as 73 or so, Pinkerton was engaged by the railroad companies and put a lot of resources and a lot of effort into trying to catch the James Younger gang. In fact, they had some operatives to go undercover to infiltrate the gang, or to infiltrate the families and close associates of gang members, and they would always turn up dead. Frustrated with having gotten no results from the Pinkerton agency, the railroads terminated their contract with them, and Alan Pinkerton took that as a personal insult, to the extent that even though he was not being paid, he continued pursuing the James Younger gang, his agency did, on his own dime. In fact, he actually went down to Missouri personally to lead the efforts, and that's him seated there with two of his agents standing beside him. In March of 1874, on a quiet road in Missouri, two Pinkerton agents and a sheriff's deputy confronted Jim and John Younger, not initially knowing it was Jim and John Younger, but Jim and John Younger figured out they were Pinkerton agents and opened fire on them. There was a gunfight in which one of the Pinkerton agents and the sheriff's deputy were killed. The other Pinkerton escaped, and John Younger was shot dead. So he was actually, of all the younger brothers, he was the only one to die violently by a gunshot wound in pursuit of his criminal career. Well, that's even more of an insult to Alan Pinkerton, and so he threw caution to the wind, led a raid on the home of Jesse and Frank James's mother, and his men threw a bomb, essentially, into the house, threw it down the chimney, an incendiary device, and it blew up. By the way, Jesse and Frank James were not home. They didn't live there. Their 9-year-old youngest brother was, and he was killed. He was blown up. And their mother had her arm blown off. This was a huge scandal. for the Pinkertons, and actually backfired significantly in really significantly raising sympathies among the people of Missouri for the James and younger outlaw families. So Pinkerton withdrew. The James Younger gang, however, kept right on robbing banks. And in fact, they had what they thought was a pretty good idea. And that idea was to hit a bank that was significantly outside their normal range of activity, thinking that perhaps, they would have the element of surprise. And they chose the bank in Northfield, Minnesota, well outside their Kansas and Missouri stomping grounds. The reason that they chose that particular bank is that they believed, erroneously as it turned out, that the bank was partly owned by former Union General Benjamin Butler. Anyway, they headed up to Northfield, Minnesota, and cased out the town. Actually, they had another town, another bank in mind that they decided to pass on, but they went to Northfield, Minnesota. Jesse and Frank James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, Clell Miller, who was a longtime member of their gang and had also been with Quantrill's Raiders. His brother Ed had sometimes operated with the gang. And a guy named Charlie Pitts and a guy named Bill Stillwell, or Bill Stiles. I'm sorry, Bill Chadwell, sometimes called Bill Stiles. 8 of them. They rode into town on this day in September 7th, 1876, which just happened to be, and they weren't aware of this, the opening day of hunting season in Minnesota. So a lot of people were wandering around with their rifles, as it turned out. Anyway, they went into Northfield, and 3 of them went inside the bank to rob it. 2 of them stood guard at the door, and 3 others stood across the street to be on hand if needed. The 3 guys robbing the bank informed the teller, "We're robbing the bank, open the safe right now." And the teller said, and it turns out this was a lie, that it was on a time-delayed safe, that it didn't have a combination and he couldn't open it, which was very frustrating. And then the assistant teller hightailed it out the back door, so they took a shot at him, which aroused the attention of the town, which, as it turned out, had already been aroused, because some people thought it was odd, these 2 guys loitering around the front of the bank. Looked a little suspicious. A local businessman had come kind of close, just close enough to see in the window where he saw that the bank was being robbed. And he went running through town saying, "Grab your guns, they're robbing the bank." And lo and behold, a lot of people had guns, and they grabbed them. Now, this is 1876, so about 11 years after the end of the Civil War. Many of the townspeople, many of these farmers, might well have been Civil War veterans, just like the James Younger gang mostly was, although they would have been veterans on the other side. And they opened fire. A hail of bullets met the gang members, the 3 who came running out of the bank. Essentially, the streets there of Northfield became a shooting gallery. There were Minnesotans shooting from out of windows, shooting from around corners, shooting from behind barrels, and just shooting from every which way. And it became a veritable killing field there. couple of Minnesotans were killed. The bank teller was shot in the head by the robbers on their way out, and a Swedish immigrant who was firing at them was shot and killed. Another local person was wounded, but the gang took the brunt of it. Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell were killed, shot dead on the street. All three Younger brothers were grievously wounded. Bob Younger was shot in the elbow and then also in the chest. Cole Younger was shot 11 times and survived. But perhaps the most gruesome injury was the one sustained by Jim Younger. He was shot in the face with a bullet coming in one side of his face and then coming out the other and taking part of his jaw with it. Well, the six remaining members, three of them seriously wounded, uh, managed to get on their horses, get out of town, and split up. Jesse and Frank James went one direction, and then the three seriously wounded Youngers and Charlie Pitts went the other. Jesse and Frank managed to get away. However, the Youngers were unable to get too far. By the way, there were posses, not just a posse. There were posses mobilized, hundreds of people, possibly one of the biggest manhunts in American history from all the surrounding towns, just spread out and looking for these outlaws. And they caught up with them, and there was another gunfight in which Charlie Pitts was also killed, and the three Younger brothers were captured, and eventually wound up in prison where they had plenty of time to recuperate. And that was the end of the story for the Younger part of the James Younger gang, because they were sent to prison for a long time. Bob Younger never made it out of prison. He died there 13 years later in 1889 of tuberculosis. Jim and Cole did get out about 25 years after they went in. In 1901, they were paroled, and a few months later, Jim Younger committed suicide in St. Paul, Minnesota. Cole lived several years after that, and we'll come back around to him in a little bit. For a little historical context, the Great Northfield attempted bank robbery took place 2 months after General Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's command was wiped out, 1 month after Wild Bill Hickok was murdered in Deadwood in Dakota Territory, and 2 months before the presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. After having barely escaped with their lives and their freedom from the Northfield fiasco, Jesse and Frank James laid low for a while. After that, they moved to the Nashville area and lived there for some time under the pseudonyms of Thomas Howard and B.J. Woodson, Jesse James being Thomas Howard. You know, when I was growing up in Sparta, Tennessee, I'd always heard stories that Jesse James had hidden out around the Upper Cumberland area also. And the fact is that the Younger brothers' mother, Beersheba, was from McMinnville, which is the next town south of Sparta. So they definitely had connections in the Upper Cumberland area and in Middle Tennessee in general. Well, things stayed pretty quiet for the James brothers in their new identities with their families for about 3 years in Tennessee. But Jesse started getting a little bit of the old itch and put together a new gang in 1879. Frank wasn't part of this go around. But Jesse and his new gang did several robberies in Alabama and Mississippi, and one in, I think, Louisiana. And after a while, it becoming known that Jesse James was active again, started getting a little hot for them in Tennessee. They were afraid that they were raising suspicions. And so Jesse decided to take his family and move back home to Missouri, where he felt he would be safer and have more of a support system. Frank James felt like, yeah, probably the opposite of that is true. So he took his family and went further east to Virginia. So 1881, Jesse James and his family, still living under the fake name of Howard, moved to St. Joseph, Missouri. And by this time, several members of his new gang had been killed or captured. He still had a few, but he needed some new recruits. And he turned to two young brothers, the Ford brothers, Charlie and Bob. Charlie was 25 years old, and he had been on several robberies with Jesse James and his gang. Bob had not been. He was a potential new recruit. Now, I should mention at this time that Frank James and his sojourn in Virginia didn't last very long. Within a short time, he was back in Missouri as well, robbing trains along with his brother. Anyhow, Jesse was planning another robbery, and he invited the Ford brothers, Charlie and his little brother, to his house to lay plans to discuss the possible robbery. Now, there was a reward for Jesse James by this time of $10,000. And very famously, once the Fords were in his home, while Jesse's wife and children were in the next room, Jesse turned his back on them and got up on a chair to adjust a picture. Some stories have him dusting off a picture, some have him straightening it. Some stories say that, and here's some irony, that the picture said, "God bless this home." Anyhow, turned his back on them, and Bob Ford took the opportunity to safely shoot him in the back of the head and kill him, and go claim the reward, which he and his brother Charlie did. So, that was the end of Jesse James at the age of 35. Now, the Fords tried to cash in on the celebrity of having killed Jesse James without stopping to think about the fact that a lot of people romanticized Jesse James, and a lot of people did not romanticize shooting someone in the back of the head while you were a guest in their home. Bob Ford was referred to as the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. What about Frank? Well, like I said, Frank had been involved in a couple of robberies as well. By the way, the death of Jesse James was in 1882. Shortly after that, Frank James surrendered to the governor of Missouri and was tried not for the long distance, long ago in time crimes. One of his requirements, by the way, to surrender was that he not be extradited to Minnesota, which he was not. He was tried for Missouri robberies only, and he was acquitted. So he never went to prison, and instead he moved out to Oklahoma with his mother, and had a peaceful life thereafter. He was a ticket master at a burlesque show for a while. He was a shoe salesman for a while. And then here is where Cole Younger comes back into the story as promised. In 1903, 2 years after Cole was released from prison, Cole Younger and Frank James put together their own Wild West show and traveled around the country. 1915, Frank James passed away. Cole Younger passed away the year after. So there is the story of the most famous of all the outlaw robber gangs of the Old West. There have been dozens of movies made about the James Younger Gang. Here are three of the most famous and three of the best. Starting from left to right here, way back in 1939, Henry Fonda and Tyrone Power as Frank and Jesse James in the movie Jesse James. And then there was a sequel called The Return of Frank James. And then in the middle, you see Cliff Robertson and Robert Duvall as Cole Younger and Jesse James in the 1972 movie The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid. And then over on the right, from 2007, a very highly critically acclaimed film with Brad Pitt as Jesse James and Casey Affleck as Bob Howard. The film was called The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. However, for my money, my personal favorite, and the one that I think is probably the most historically accurate, remains the 1980 film The Long Riders, which featured the three Carradine brothers as the three younger brothers, and the Keach brothers, James and Stacy, as Jesse and Frank James, and even starred the Quaid brothers, Dennis and Randy, as the Miller brothers, Ed and Clell, and the Guest brothers as the Ford brothers. The story of the James Younger Gang is pretty straightforward. You know, it's pretty easy to follow. It's easy to understand. They started off as Confederate guerrillas, where they got in the habit, really, of robbing things, and they just kept doing it after the war, professionally. This next group that we're going to talk about is a little more complex than that. It's not quite so straightforward. I'm talking about Billy the Kid and the Regulators and the Lincoln County War in Lincoln County, New Mexico, which was in 1878, and the events which followed lasted into 1881. So with this story, we do have outlaws and gunfighters, and we got a big range war. In this case, at least in the beginning, the outlaws and gunfighters in question were part of the range war, much like Clay Allison was up in northern New Mexico in the Colfax County Range War. But it became more, like I said, more complex. In order to have a better understanding of the situation, we need to have a little context, particularly some historical context. So let's go back to the Civil War and recall that the Navajo people were removed from their traditional homeland and sent to the Bosque Redondo reservation under the supervision of Kit Carson. And then if you remember from that previous lecture, it was a lousy, horrible place, unable to sustain human life pretty much. And eventually they were allowed to go back home. Now they'd been there at Bosque Redondo with the Mescalero Apaches, who were their actual traditional enemies. Mescaleros didn't get sent back to the Navajo homeland, obviously. They were sent a little bit further south where a reservation was set up for them, and you can see there these are the reservations in New Mexico today, but the boundaries of the Mescalero Apache Reservation are the same today as they were in 1873 when they were moved just a little bit southwest of where they are now. And what we're going to be talking about so far as the beginning with the context now is the year 1876. All right, same year as the Northfield, Minnesota bank raid that was the Waterloo of the James Younger gang, same year as the deaths of Custer and Wild Bill Hickok. So let's take a look at the forts in New Mexico at this time. In fact, let's zoom in on this map so we can see it a little bit better. And you will notice before we talk about the specific forts, well, this is New Mexico, which we have talked about several times in previous lectures. Most recently, we talked about, well, you'll notice there's Socorro, which is where El Fuego Baca became or would become the sheriff, county sheriff there about 10 years after the events we're now discussing. And over there is Frisco, where El Fuego Baca had his famous standoff. Also, further north there, you can see where the Colfax County War was taking place, centered in the town of Cimarron, and that's where Clay Allison was heavily involved. And we also talked about New Mexico when we discussed cattle drives, particularly the Goodnight Loving Trail that came up from Texas into New Mexico through Fort Stanton up to Santa Fe, and then later through Colorado and to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And this trail started right after the Civil War, within a year or two, and this lasted for several years. And if you recall in that discussion, we talked about the fact that Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving had a partner in New Mexico, a guy named John Chisholm, who was married, I think, to Oliver Loving's cousin. Chisholm owned a big ranch right around the area there below where his picture is. And so he became their partner. And remember also why Goodnight and Loving chose to drive their cattle to New Mexico instead of north to Kansas. They were doing that because they were going to be providing their cattle for beef to the U.S. Army, not just at Fort Stanton, but also to be sent over to Fort Sumner and the Bosque Redondo initially. Of course, that was later abandoned, but being able to provide cattle to the military with all these forts was a very valuable proposition. And if you'll notice, there's also, in addition to Fort Stanton there, well, of course, you've got the Bosque Redondo, Fort Sumner, which was there. The fort remained after that reservation was dispersed. You will also notice there's a bunch of forts along the Rio Grande / Rio Grande. And you'll notice that the aforementioned Fort Stanton that the Goodnight Loving Trail passed through is right there just west of Lincoln, the little town of Lincoln in Lincoln County, New Mexico. Now, we mentioned that the Navajos were allowed to return back to their traditional homeland up in northwestern New Mexico and into Arizona, but the Mescaleros, why, their reservation was right there just south of Lincoln. So, as I said earlier, just like, literally less than a minute ago, being able to provide beef to the U.S. government in order to feed all the soldiers at all these forts, as well as the reservations, because the U.S. government was responsible for providing food to the Indians that they can find on those reservations, was a very lucrative operation. And you'll notice that Lincoln is right there, situated in a place that if you had a cattle ranch there, you could be providing beef to the Mescalero Reservation, to Fort Stanton, And you would be not too far away from all those forts on the Rio Grande, as well as Fort Sumner. So it was a really good opportunity, which John Chisholm had recognized several years before 1876. And at that time, he was still operating that large ranch. Enter these two guys. Lawrence Gustav Murphy, who usually went by L.G. Murphy, and James Dolan. L.G. Murphy was an Irish immigrant who had served in the U.S. Army for 15 years, basically all of the 1850s through the end of the Civil War. He was heavily involved in Republican politics, and after the war, he moved out west to northern New Mexico, initially to Santa Fe, where he got involved in the business, quote unquote, of essentially selling land he didn't own to unsuspecting farmers, which is kind of similar to the situation that happened there in northern New Mexico in Colfax County that had led to that range war, right? That these farmers thought the land was theirs, but it actually wasn't. In fact, he was part of what was called the Santa Fe Ring, which was a group of corrupt politicians and attorneys and real estate people, land speculators, operating out of Santa Fe, doing what I just described. Essentially, this is what they were all about was kind of taking advantage of the confusion that arose from the old Spanish land grants being translated into the American system, and doing that in such a way that they were able to make a whole lot of money off of it. And essentially, they controlled the politics and the law enforcement all through the state. Now, 1869, L.G. Murphy moved out of Santa Fe, moved south to Lincoln, New Mexico, and opened up, well, he started a bank and he opened up a mercantile or a dry goods store, which are both terms we don't use in the U.S. really anymore. Essentially the same thing as a general store, which we also don't use a whole lot. So essentially, a store that sold stuff that was not liquid, basically. That sold, manufactured clothing, that sold toiletry items, that sold some grocery items like flour and coffee that didn't include liquid. So he started that up, and 1873 he hired on someone to work with him, a guy named James Dolan, who was also an Irish immigrant. And within a short time, he made Dolan his partner by 1874. Now, a lot of the people in the area who lived around there traded at this general store because it was the only one. And a lot of people felt like Murphy and Dolan took advantage of that fact by really gouging them on prices. Nonetheless, they had an enormous amount of leverage there in the county. In fact, I mentioned the Santa Fe Ring controlled law enforcement. Well, in Lincoln County, the local sheriff was also an Irish immigrant, and he lived in a home on land that he had bought by borrowing money from Murphy and Dolan and their bank. So they're basically leveraging their situation there to essentially have a whole lot of control in Lincoln County. Then in 1876, enter these two gentlemen. On the left, we see John Tunstall, an English immigrant who was 23 years old in 1876. He was the son of a relatively successful mercantile business owner, and he came to the United States looking for business opportunities of his own, and he wound up in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1876. And while there, he met Alexander McSween, a Scottish Canadian immigrant who was in his late 30s around that time, and who was a good friend of John Chisholm. McSween convinced Tunstall that cattle is where the money is, and so they got the backing of John Chisholm, got John Chisholm as an ally, and they went to Lincoln, Lincoln, New Mexico, and Tunstall bought a ranch about 30 miles south of town, and he and McSween set up a dry goods store slash mercantile slash bank there in Lincoln, where the same sort of operation was already being run, of course, by those previous individuals who had a monopoly on things, and their monopoly was now ended. By the way, the Murphy Dolan operation was referred to informally as the House. Well, the House was no longer in order because Tunstall and McSween, with their operation, started selling goods at substantially lower prices than Murphy and Dolan, and they started to get all the business of the people in the area, and the House, the Murphy Dolan operation, started losing money pretty rapidly, to the extent that they were in danger of being bankrupted, which is not the sort of thing that they took kindly to. So Murphy and Dolan actually wound up hiring a bunch of outlaws, several outlaw gangs known for robbery and rustling, including a group that called themselves the Seven Rivers Warriors, who were essentially small ranchers that hated John Chisholm and operated against him any way they could. Also, the John Kinney Gang. There's John Kinney on the left with a couple of his gang members who were robbers and rustlers. And also, former member of the John Kinney Gang, the Jesse Evans, shown here with a well-armed girlfriend who had pretty large gang of his own. So they were engaged by Murphy and Dolan under the table, kind of, although eventually some of them wound up being deputized by the county sheriff. But initially in 1877, they were engaged to harass Tunstall in any way possible, including rustling his cattle whenever possible. Of course, young Tunstall had to have some cowboys to work his ranch, and so he had a few cowboys hired on, but he began also to hire on some less than savory characters to counteract the bunch that Murphy and Dolan had operating against him and endangering his ranch. So among some of the people who were working for Tunstall were his foreman, a highly respected rancher from the area named Dick Brewer, and also a Mexican-American outlaw named Jose Chavez y Chavez, and Doc Skurlock, Charlie Beaudry, Frank McNabb, and several others, including, but not limited to, George and Frank Coe, a guy named French, several others, and oh yeah, this guy, an 18-year-old orphan from New York City originally, named Henry McCarty, who was also known as Henry Antrim, which was the name of his estranged stepfather. By 1877, He was in southeastern New Mexico, operating as a horse thief at the age of 17, and people started to call him Kid Antrim. By the time he was hired by Tunstall, he was operating under yet another pseudonym, William H. Bonney. But of course, by the time the Lincoln County War is well underway, he's going to be known, and remains known, as Billy the Kid. Well, situation developed in which Tunstall's partner, McSwain, was hired to be the executor of, essentially, hired by the executors of the will of a fellow who was a business associate of Murphy and Dolan, hired to be able to settle accounts on this guy's life insurance policy after he had passed away. Murphy and Dolan claimed that the guy owed them an enormous amount of money, so therefore all that settlement needed to come straight to them. Now, was this true? It's really hard to say, because they were desperate for money, because they were being seriously hurt by the competition from Tunstall and McSwain. McSwain may have felt that they were asking for something that wasn't actually coming to them just to be able to sustain their business. It's also possible that he wanted to make sure they couldn't sustain their business. Whatever the reasons for all the actors involved, McSwain did not give them that money that they demanded, and so they went to court and got an order to a court order to seize McSwain's property. Since Tunstall was a business partner of McSwain, the Murphy-Dolan combo sent Sheriff William Brady to Tunstall's ranch to seize all of his cattle. Now, actually, McSwain had no connection to the Tunstall ranch, so that wasn't his property. Nonetheless, Brady and his posse, made up largely of those outlaws that Murphy and Dolan had hired, showed up at the ranch. However, it turned out that nobody was home, because Tunstall and about half a dozen of his cowboys had left the ranch, headed up to Lincoln with 9 horses that they were taking up there. So Brady and his posse pursued them northward and caught up with them, and his deputies / outlaws immediately opened fire on Tunstall and his cowboys, and they all took cover to return fire. Tunstall, the 23-year-old English dry goods merchant, not an old hand at gunplay, wound up getting separated. He actually delayed in following the cowboys, and a couple of the deputies chased him down, and he was shot twice, once in the heart and once in the brain. Now, the cowboys of Tunstall who witnessed this said that he was murdered, that he was shot down, but the deputies claimed that he was shot while resisting arrest. However you look at it, he was dead. Now, apparently, young Tunstall, was a very likable guy, and these cowboys that worked for him, even some of the more hardened ones, were extremely fond of him and extremely loyal to him. So after the Tunstall cowboys escaped from that posse, they went into Lincoln and went to the justice of the peace and made a complaint, and they were deputized by the justice of the peace to arrest those deputy / outlaws of Brady's. So you've now got 2 groups of individuals, many of whom are outlaws. Uh, both groups legally deputized, and both groups trying to apprehend each other. The the posse, made up of Tunstall's cowboys, was of course led by the foreman, Dick Brewer. So this uh, ensuing situation, kind of similar to the Earp's Ride of Vengeance after the gunfight at the OK Corral. The posse led by Dick Brewer, who were calling themselves the Regulators, essentially hunted down and killed several of those Brady deputies who had been involved in the killing of Tunstall. And before too long, they had even ambushed and killed Sheriff Brady himself. 3 days after the killing of Sheriff Brady, and by the way, this is April 1878, the Regulators stopped at the home of Buckshot Roberts, a grizzled older guy that worked for James Dolan, who may not have actually been involved in the murder of Tunstall. In fact, probably wasn't, but he did work for for Dolan and Murphy. And so the Regulators came to his house demanding that he surrender. And having heard about all the killings that had been going on, he figured that that was not a good idea on his part. He refused to surrender and opened fire on them with his rifle. They opened fire on him. He was shot in the stomach, a couple of other places as well, but he kept firing. He wounded several of the Regulators and managed to make his way into his house and barricaded himself up and was still returning fire. Now, before he got to the house, shortly after that, the Seven Rivers Warriors gang ambushed a group of Regulators, killing Frank McNabb and wounding several others, in retaliation for which the Regulators virtually wiped out that gang. And also, as the fighting continued, more and more casualties mounted on both sides. Finally, in July of 1878, McSween and the Regulators dug in Lincoln, quartered in McSween's house and several other buildings around town. By this time, McSween had brought in 41 more men to join the Regulators, which he had hired in large part with the assistance of John Chisholm, who had in fact been helping to financially support the Regulators since the death of Tunstall. So they're there in McSween's house in town, several of them. Several of them are quartered in a bunkhouse not far from McSween's house, and several of them were stationed on top of a nearby saloon, sort of as lookouts. Now, the new county sheriff, George Pepin, stationed some sharpshooters. Pepin, by the way, a friend of Murphy and Dolan, no surprise there. And he was still utilizing that core group of outlaws that they had hired. So he stationed some snipers on top of nearby buildings to try to pick off the regulators on the saloon, but that backfired because they wound up, some of them getting picked off instead. So this was the beginning of a siege that lasted for, depending on how you look at it, 4 to 5 days, and you'll understand what I mean by that in a moment. So this siege, very dramatic, with an occasional casualty being experienced on Pepin's side. Pepin called in for assistance from the U.S. Army in Fort Sumner, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley, who initially resisted coming into the situation, but eventually did on the day of July the 18th. So when he showed up with a large number of cavalry troopers, that pretty much ended the overall resistance, in the sense that most of those 41 new hires dispersed and left town, rather than face not just the local sheriff and his outlaw deputies, but also the United States Army. And so McSween was left with his core group, which by this time also included a guy named Tom Folliard. Well, here's what I mean by, was it 4 days or was it 5 days? That night, so that was the night of the fourth day. Late that night, July the 18th, but actually by this time the midnight hour had turned and it was July 19th. His house was attacked by several of Pepin's deputies who set fire to the house. And so as the house was blazing, the various regulators made a break for it. Billy the Kid escaped unharmed. His new friend Tom Folliard was hit in the shoulder, and 5 of the regulator group were killed in this attempt to escape the burning building. And one of them was Alexander McSween. He was shot down. So the remaining regulators, the survivors, were able to get out of town, and that was pretty much the official end of the Lincoln County War. So this was July 19th, 1878. Doc Scurlock went to Texas, got married, raised a family. The 2 Coe brothers also went straight, but Billy the Kid and Charlie Beaudry and Jose Chavez, as well as Tom Folliard, they became kind of the nucleus of an outlaw gang themselves, led by Billy the Kid. So after this, Billy the Kid and those who remained with him did become professional criminals. Meanwhile, L.G. Murphy, the guy who, along with his younger partner Dolan, essentially had started all this, by October, 3 months after the big fight there, the Battle of Lincoln, he died of cancer. He was in a pretty bad way by July, so he passed away in October, and Dolan inherited his part of the business. Dolan wound up taking over all of Tunstall's land as well. So he wound up being pretty well situated when all this was over. Meanwhile, President Rutherford B. Hayes fired the territorial governor of New Mexico and replaced him with this guy, Lew Wallace. There on the left is a photo of Wallace later in life. And then there's also a photo of him earlier in life when he was a famous Civil War general. So he's brought in by President Hayes to try to get a handle on the territory and try to do something about the rampant violence that the previous governor had proven unable to handle. Now, Wallace would actually become most famous not for any of this, but for this book that he wrote, Ben-Hur, that was published in 1880. So he was still working on this when he took over as the territorial governor of New Mexico. A month after assuming his new office, Governor Wallace was informed that an indictment. A month after assuming office, Governor Wallace was informed that there were warrants for Billy the Kid and others, but that they had not been served in Lincoln County due to, quote, the disturbed nature of that county. So therefore, in November of 1878, when Governor Wallace announced an amnesty for everyone involved in the Lincoln County War, unless they had been indicted or convicted of a crime, therefore that amnesty did not apply to Billy the Kid. It also did not apply to James Dolan, who had been indicted for the murder of Tunstall and was being investigated for the murder of McSween. McSween's widow had hired a lawyer named Houston Chapman to pursue this case. And in February of 1879, when Billy and his friend Tom Folliard happened to be in Lincoln, they were on hand when apparently some of Dolan's men got the drop on them, and also got the drop on that lawyer who was pursuing their boss, Chapman. And while Jesse Evans, remember him, held a gun on Billy and Tom, one of the other gunmen working for Dolan killed the lawyer and then set fire to his body. And there were witnesses to the incident, and those witnesses agreed that Billy and Tom had not participated in this crime. They managed to slip away. Nonetheless, Dolan blamed it on them. Billy contacted the governor and offered to testify against Dolan and his men in return for that amnesty that he had not gotten. And the governor promised him that amnesty if he would come in and be prepared to testify. Governor Wallace recommended that Billy consent to being put into protective custody in the Lincoln County Jail by the new sheriff of Lincoln County to protect him from his enemies until after he could testify. So Billy agreed to that. He came in, and he was in custody at the jail, and he did, in fact, testify. However, things didn't work out so well. First, in that the person who had killed that lawyer, a guy named Billy Campbell, was actually in jail as well, and he escaped. He got away, and about a year later killed somebody else and was lynched for it. And James Dolan stood trial for the murder of Tunstall, and he was acquitted. Meanwhile, Billy was still in jail, and he started to think that maybe he had been tricked. So finally, in June of 1879, he broke out of jail and escaped and left, and changed his base of operations to Fort Sumner from that point forward. And he went up there and reunited with his gang and continued his life of crime. He was involved in another shooting or two and a couple of close scrapes with posses. And then about a year later, his gang was joined by Arkansas Dave Rudabaugh, later known as Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, whom we've talked about before. He had previously run afoul of both Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson back in Kansas. Now he's relocated to New Mexico. Now we have another new character entering the story, Pat Garrett, originally from Alabama, who in November 1880 was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico, the fourth sheriff they'd had in 2 years. However, in addition to being sheriff, he also got an appointment as a deputy United States Marshal, which gave him the jurisdictional authority to pursue Billy the Kid outside of Lincoln County. And that's just what he did. In fact, in December 19th, 1880, up in Fort Sumner, where Billy had reportedly been seen many times, Garrett and a posse lay in wait, waiting for Billy to come into town. And indeed he did with his gang. He had with him Charlie Beaudry and Tom Folliard and Dave Rudabaugh and a couple of others. Didn't have Chavez with him because Chavez had actually come in, like Billy, to testify against McSween and was put in protective custody and didn't manage to get back out by this time. Anyhow, mistaking Tom Folliard for Billy the Kid, Garrett and his whole posse concentrated their fire on him and shot him to pieces, which meant that the Kid and the others were able to escape. However, Garrett and his posse pursued them to a place called Stinking Springs, which is right there on the edge of the Llano Estacado, New Mexico-Texas border. And there was another shootout, and this time Charlie Beaudry was killed, and the rest of the gang was captured, including Billy, who was taken back to Lincoln County to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff William Brady 2 years before. In April of 1881, he was found guilty and sentenced to hang. So he was there in the Lincoln County Jail, and which is located the same building as the courthouse. And he was being guarded by two of Garrett's deputies. A guy named James W. Bell, who in addition to being a deputy sheriff was also a deputy United States Marshal, and Bob Ollinger, who had been one of the Seven Rivers Warriors and who had been involved early on back in '78 in the Lincoln County War on the side of Murphy and Dolan. So Billy knew him. He knew Bob. And one day he was in his jail cell, and Bob Ollinger was sitting outside the cell loading his shotgun. And Ollinger said, whoever takes these loads is in for a hard time. And Billy agreed, but he said, "Be careful there, Bob, that you don't shoot yourself by accident." Well, shortly after that, Bob went across the street to get lunch, leaving Deputy Bell in charge. There's a couple of different stories about what happened. Some people say that someone had smuggled a pistol to Billy and hidden it in the outhouse. So when he was escorted to the outhouse to do his business, he retrieved that pistol, hid it until he got back into the jail. Some other stories say that he overpowered Deputy Bell and took the pistol away from him. But either way, he shot Deputy Bell dead. Ollinger heard the shot and assumed that Bell had killed Billy, and so he sort of leisurely strolled into the jail, and there was Billy waiting for him, holding his own shotgun that he had loaded in front of Billy earlier. And Billy said, "Hello, Bob," and emptied both barrels into him, blowing him to pieces. And Billy made good his escape one more time. On July 14th, 1881, 3 years to the day since the beginning of that siege and the Battle of Lincoln County, Pat Garrett went to Fort Sumner to kind of nose around and talk to some of Billy's acquaintances to see if he could get a lead on where he was. And he discovered that Billy was staying in the home of a mutual friend of theirs, Pete Maxwell. So that evening, Garrett let himself into that house, which was nobody was home, and went into Maxwell's bedroom, actually. And later that evening, when Billy came in and went to bed, or was about to go to bed, he'd been drinking, dancing with a local senorita. He heard a noise, and so, pistol in hand, he walked through the darkness into the doorway of Maxwell's bedroom where he had heard the noise, and he said, "Quién es?" which is Spanish for "who is it?" And Garrett responded by firing two shots, the first of which hit Billy in the heart. The second one missed because he was falling down because he'd just been shot in the heart. And that was the end of Billy the Kid. Garrett became famous as a result, of course, for having been the guy that finally killed Billy the Kid. Wrote a book about it, and then much later on, about 21 years later, after having served as a sheriff in other places, Garrett, when he was in his 50s, early 50s, was murdered in New Mexico, perhaps due to a dispute with a neighboring rancher. So those are the fates of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. Much like the James Younger gang, there have been a gazillion movies made about Billy the Kid. Some of them pretty good, like both of these, although it should be said that, contrary to popular belief, Billy the Kid was not left-handed. The famous picture of him holding a rifle in what appears to be his left hand that gave rise to that idea was due to the fact that those old 19th century daguerreotypes were actually mirror images. Anyhow, some pretty good ones. The famous picture of him holding a rifle in what appears to be his left hand that gave rise to that idea was due to the fact that those old 19th century daguerreotypes were actually mirror images. Anyhow, some pretty good ones, some not so good. More recent one that actually plays into the idea, the legend that Billy the Kid had faked his death, and this is about him as an older man. And then there's this one. I'm not quite sure exactly how to describe it, other than to say that it's fun. But perhaps surprisingly, in my opinion, the best and most accurate movies about Billy the Kid were the Young Guns movies in 1988 and 1990. They are the most comprehensive telling of the story, and generally speaking, pretty accurate, other than the ending of Young Guns 2, which, well, let me just say that there's an old guy named Brushy Bill Roberts that came along many decades later, claimed to be the real Billy the Kid. But anyhow, that's what makes things legendary, isn't it? Now we're going to go back to talking about outlaw gangs that were strict, pure, straight out bank and train robbers. And we're going to start with the Dalton Gang, which consisted at its core of four brothers, Grat, Bob, Emmett, and Bill. However, there were in reality five Dalton brothers. They had an older brother named Frank, and also a cousin named Bill Doolin, who's going to play an important role in the gang and then in our story. The five Dalton brothers, as of 1889, 1890, were all deputy United States Marshals operating in Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma, and operating out of the court, the Western Arkansas District Court, that was headquartered in the courthouse in Fort Smith, Arkansas, presided over by the hanging judge himself, Judge Isaac Parker. In 1890, the oldest brother, Frank, was killed in the line of duty. And this, coupled with the fact that it was all they could do to scrape up the money for his funeral, made the other four brothers think a little bit about their choices in life. Here they were serving the law, barely getting by, barely making a living, can't even afford to bury their dead brother without great difficulty. So maybe, they thought, we should be on the other side. And so that's what they did. They formed a gang that eventually grew to include several members. They started robbing trains and later moved on to banks. So starting in January of 1891 through to almost the end of 1892. So a little less than 2 years was the ride of the Dalton Gang. Before very long, the four men who had once been Deputy United States Marshals were being pursued by Deputy United States Marshals. And the person leading that pursuit, heading it up, was their old friend, Deputy United States Marshal Heck Thomas, whom we have discussed a couple of times already. Well, the full roster of the gang eventually was 9 or 10 members, depending on how you look at it. In addition to the four Dalton brothers, there was also Dick Broadwell, Bill Powers, Bitter Creek Newcomb, Charlie Pierce, and Blackface Charlie Bryant. Now, some people don't include Bill Doolin as a full member because most of the time there initially he was just holding the horses. So let's talk briefly about Blackface Charlie Bryant. Where did he get that name? Why, from the fact that he was in a very close quarters gunfight and the other person fired their gun right next to his face, and the powder burned his face permanently. He had black powder basically tattooed into his face. Now, Blackface Charlie was known to have a hair trigger, to be a little bit trigger happy, a little bit gun crazy, a little bit violent. And when you're in a group like the Dalton Gang and you're the one with the reputation for being a little violent, that really says something. In August of 1891, Blackface Charlie got sick. So the rest of the gang checked him into a hotel and sent a doctor to him. And while he was recuperating in the hotel, a U.S. Deputy Marshal named Ed Short learned he was there and walked right in and arrested him and took him along, put him on a train to Wichita, Kansas, to turn him over to the district court there. And while they were on the train, not having heard about Bob Ollinger, I guess, he left his prisoner alone for a minute, while he went to use the restroom. And while Short was gone, a sympathetic person on the train slipped a pistol to Blackface Charlie. So when Deputy Marshal Ed Short got back, Charlie shot him in the chest, but before he died, Marshal Short shot him in the chest. And so before the train stopped, they were both dead. So that made Blackface Charlie the first member of the Dalton Gang to bite the dust. This illustration of Blackface Charlie, by the way, is by Bob Bose Bell, who also happens to be the editor of True West magazine. I should mention something about some family connections. Remember when I said earlier that Jesse and Frank James sometimes are described as the cousins of the younger brothers. They were actually cousins by marriage. However, the Daltons were literal cousins of the younger family. In fact, they were first cousins, although they were of the next generation, 15, 20 years younger on the average than the younger brothers. Anyhow, they certainly followed in the footsteps of their famous relatives in robbing banks and trains, and they robbed a lot of them there in that couple of year period. However, they still felt that they were unfavorably compared to their much more famous relatives, the Youngers and the James Younger gang in general. This was a time period when, a few years after his death, Jesse James was being probably more romanticized than ever before. So they decided to do something that the James Younger gang had never done, and that was rob two banks at the same time. And they decided that the town where they would pull off this trick would be Coffeyville, Kansas. So on October the 5th, 1892, five of the gang members rode into Coffeyville, Kansas. The other four, these gentlemen right here, stayed just outside of town with extra horses, and the five others, which were the other three Dalton brothers, plus Dick Broadwell and Bill Powers, they went into town to rob the banks. Well, there's a reason the James Younger gang never did that, nor even tried it, and that reason is it's a bad idea. Spreading yourself a little too thin. Anyhow, remember the description of the Northfield, Minnesota bank robbery that was the Waterloo for the James Younger gang? Well, that was an enjoyable, breezy day compared to what awaited the Dalton gang in Coffeyville, Kansas. Of the five members of the gang who went in to pull off this double bank robbery, only one lived to tell about it, and he was shot up pretty bad. And that was young Emmett, who was 21 years old. The other four, all shot dead. However, Emmett did manage to beat Cole Younger's record at something, and that was the record of being shot. He was shot more than twice as many times as Cole Younger had been in Minnesota. I think 23 bullets in all, and managed to survive, and then spent a long time in prison. So this left these four guys the only surviving members. That day, October 5th, 1892, was the official end of the Dalton gang, but it was the beginning of the nucleus of a brand new gang that's sometimes called the Doolin-Dalton gang, because the two Bills, Doolin and Dalton, were viewed as the co-leaders, at least initially, of this gang. Also called sometimes the Wild Bunch, which they were not the only gang to be called that, but they were the first gang to be called that. And also sometimes called the Oklahombres. Altogether, there were 11 people who served as members of the Wild Bunch or the Doolin Dalton gang, although not all at once. Some of them were reinforcements for others. This group did have a little bit more flair than the original Dalton gang. For example, they all wore matching dusters, which are those long coats, as kind of a uniform. Also, closely associated with the gang were these two young ladies, Anna McDoulet and Jenny Stevens, also known as Cattle Annie and Little Britches. These were two teenage girls in their mid-teens who were horse thieves and cattle rustlers and served as spies and lookouts for the main gang. Now, there were plenty of federal marshals on their trail, because they also spent, well, about 2 years at their height, but really the last of them wasn't brought in until 1896. So a lot more banks and trains being robbed. And the The three individuals who wound up taking point in the federal posses pursuing them were these three guys that we have mentioned before, sometimes referred to as the Three Guardsmen of Oklahoma. So you had Heck Thomas, you had Bill Tillman, former marshal of Dodge City, before that deputy sheriff to Bat Masterson, and Chris Madsen, who was a Danish immigrant. At various times, they had up to 100 deputy United States marshals under their command, although not all at the same time. It's not like there were 103 guys riding around. They were more likely often split up into still fairly large groups, kind of patrolling the area, trying to find this gang. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, these guys and their huge number of deputy marshals were probably the inspiration for the super posse, as they were referred to in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid from 1969, which was almost kind of like a running joke in the movie, that there was this huge posse accompanied by ominous music that you never got a close look at, but every time Butch and Sundance turned around, there they were, still on their trail. Butch and Sundance, of course, not a member of this iteration of the Wild Bunch. They were in a later iteration. The Wild Bunch pulled their first bank robbery in Oklahoma Territory. Actually, that was in Indian Territory, within 2 or 3 weeks after the events in Coffeyville, Kansas. And within a week or two after that, their second bank robbery, when they robbed the Ford County Bank in Kansas. Now, if you'll recall, Ford County is where Dodge City is. Well, that got the sheriff of Ford County involved, and that sheriff teamed up with the deputy United States marshals in pursuing the outlaws. The sheriff in question was this guy, Chalk Beeson, who is the guy that Luke Short had bought the Long Branch Saloon from almost a decade before this. And so another Dodge City connection. He was with Deputy United States Marshal Tom Houston when they got a lead on one of the Wild Bunch members, Oliver or Al Yantis, and they cornered him in a house in Oklahoma, and he resisted arrest, and there was a shootout, and he was killed by Houston is the one, I think. Actually, I think they may have both shot him. Anyhow, there's Yantis, the first casualty now of the Wild Bunch group. Well, let's talk a little bit about Oklahoma and Indian Territory. We've talked about it a lot in previous lectures. In 1890, May of 1890, 5 months before the disastrous efforts of the Dalton Gang to rob that Coffeyville bank, Indian Territory had been divided into 2 territories. So the eastern part remained Indian Territory, and that was the home of the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes. The other part became Oklahoma Territory, and these were those unassigned lands, and then also lands that had been kind of taken from the tribal reservations after allotment began. We talked about that earlier. And that first big Oklahoma land boom in 1889, and this led to the creation of Oklahoma Territory, and to the little town of Ingalls, right there just over the border from Indian Territory. And Ingalls was a wide open town that was known to be a refuge for outlaws of all different types. On September 1st, 1893, a posse of 14 United States Deputy United States Marshals came into the town of Ingalls to find the Wild Bunch. As it turns out, all 10 of the surviving members, 10 out of the 11, not counting old Aliantis, all 10 of them were there. In fact, I think all of them were in the same building in a saloon. The marshals found this out and opened fire on the saloon, and the gang members returned fire. Three civilians, 3 bystanders were shot, one of them fatally, and a whole lot of bullets, you have to assume, were going back and forth. At one point, this guy here, Tom Dougherty, alias Arkansas Tom Jones, ran out of the saloon and shot and killed Deputy U.S. Marshal Tom Houston, the guy who had killed Aliantis, along with Chalk Beeson in assistance not too long before. The others made their escape from the saloon out a side door, but encountered fire. Tom Jones fell back into another building and was sort of fortified in there, returning fire. And at that point, one of the marshals, under heavy fire himself, ran forward with a stick of dynamite and tossed it into the building where Arkansas Tom was. It didn't kill him, but it stunned him, literally, and he was captured. In fact, that may have been the best thing that could have happened for Arkansas Tom, because after being captured, he was sent to prison, where he stayed for 17 years, making him one of only 2 members of the Wild Bunch to live into the next decade. He was released from prison in 1910 and immediately went back to robbing banks, and in fact was killed in a shootout after a bank robbery in Kansas in 1924. But what about that Deputy United States Marshal that ran up with that stick of dynamite? That was none other than Jim Masterson, younger brother of Bat Masterson, and one-time sheriff of Ford County in Dodge City. It's fascinating how these connections keep taking place and people keep crossing paths in our story. Well, on the side of the posse, there were, in addition to several injuries, 3 Deputy U.S. Marshals were killed. On the Wild Bunch side, no one was killed. Arkansas Tom was captured. Several people were wounded, including these 2 guys, Bitter Creek Newcomb and Charlie Pierce. Both injured, neither of them real seriously. The same thing happened here that happened in Northfield, Minnesota with the James Younger gang, which is after escaping from town, they split up and all went in separate directions. Bitter Creek Newcomb and Charlie Pierce, longtime pards, in fact, holdovers from the original Dalton Gang, they stuck together, and they went to Bitter Creek Newcomb's girlfriend's house. Her name was Rose Dunn. She took them in. Unfortunately for them, Rose Dunn had several brothers, and they were all professional bounty hunters, so they came in and killed these 2 guys for the reward money. One of the brothers, sort of the leader of them, his name was Bill Dunn. He would later help Heck Thomas to track down Bill Doolin in 1896. Later that same year, in 1896, Bill Dunn, the bounty hunter, crossed paths with Sheriff Frank Canton, who had recently moved to Oklahoma from Wyoming, where he had been involved in the Johnson County War. If you remember that, he was sort of like the top gun in charge there of trying to wipe out the settlers. And that didn't go well for Bill Dunn, the bounty hunter. He was killed after that. So yet another kind of intersection among the characters who are rotating through our story. This event came to be known as the Battle of Ingalls, and it was sort of simultaneously the high point of the Wild Bunch and the beginning of the end for them. And it was a slow end over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. But things just didn't go well for them after that. They continued robbing banks and trains but they also continued being picked off one or two at a time by the Marshals Service, led by the three guardsmen of Oklahoma. Even Bill Dalton was killed by marshals in 1894, the year after this gunfight. Several others were tracked down and killed. Bill Doolin in 1896, January of 1896, he went to a bathhouse to try to get some comfort for the rheumatism in his foot, which had been shot in their second or third bank robbery as the Dalton Gang up in Cimarron, Kansas, way back in early 1891. So anyhow, that foot injury didn't slow him down too much back then, but eventually got him captured, because going to that bathhouse and being in a somewhat vulnerable situation and being followed there by Bill Tillman, the Deputy United States Marshal, former Dodge City lawman, who arrested Bill Doolin there in the bathhouse and took him into custody. However, Doolin escaped after Tillman turned him over and was at large again just for a few months until finally he was tracked down by Heck Thomas, who put an end to Bill Doolin's career with a shotgun. So that was it for this version of the Wild Bunch. Sort of gasped their last in 1896. The second iteration of the Wild Bunch, totally unconnected to these guys, but taking inspiration from them and naming themselves after them, would show up the following year. And this is that next gang. Well, it's not all of them. It's 5 of the core members. Much like the original Wild Bunch, the second Wild Bunch had a pretty large cast and sometimes a rotating cast. But yes, they were known as the Wild Bunch, and they did in fact name themselves after the original. They were also sometimes referred to as the Hole in the Wall Gang, which doesn't just mean that they were from off the beaten path. It actually refers to a place where they hid out, one of the places. And it wasn't just a place where they hid out. There's actually a couple places we're going to look at that were sort of refuges for outlaw gangs of many different stripes and varieties, sometimes at the same time. First one being the Hole in the Wall, which is in Johnson County, Wyoming. There we are in Johnson County again. It's a pass, kind of a break among these red-lined cliffs that kind of early on, by the late 1880s, a cabin had been built there. And that cabin was a meeting place for outlaws. It was kind of like a line shack, if you remember our discussion of those things that people would come in and use, and it was frequently a rendezvous point for the second Wild Bunch. Another rendezvous point was Robber's Roost, which was in Utah, and I have the whole map of the Southwest there to give you some context. The Robber's Roost was a canyon in some extremely rugged, mountainous areas along the Colorado River. And in fact, there's another famous canyon along the Colorado River, not a long way from there, that actually, kind of has a similar landscape in some ways. Of course, this canyon's not as grand as that one, but as you can see, it is very rugged. There were places there where people could hide out. It was so rugged and inaccessible that no one ever found the Wild Bunch while they were there. It's the sort of place where you could just disappear. In 1896, the very year that Bill Doolin breathed his last, and the Wild Bunch was finally brought to heel. That same year, this guy, Robert Leroy Parker, was released from prison in Wyoming. He had served 18 months of a 2-year sentence for horse theft. He was 30 years old. This was his mugshot, actually, from prison. Now, Parker was from Utah. Actually, his parents were both from England, and they had both, while in England, their families and them had converted to the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. And in the 1850s, they immigrated to the United States as Mormon pioneers into Utah. And so young Robert Leroy Parker was raised as a Mormon, but as they say, it didn't take. He got in trouble a lot. He ran away from home when he was a teenager, and he met a cattle rustler named Mike Cassidy, who sort of served as his mentor and taught him the ropes. And apparently he thought highly of him because he started using his last name. He also worked some as a cowboy, and for a while he had a job as an apprentice butcher in a butcher shop, which is where he got his nickname Butch. And that's how Robert Leroy Parker became Butch Cassidy. He robbed his first bank in 1889 when he was 23 years old, and after that, he used the money to buy a small ranch. He did some ranching, he did some rustling, he did some horse theft, he ran some scams. And then finally, his horse theft caught up with him and landed him in prison. And he got out of prison, and he hooked up with his best friend from before he went to prison, a guy named Henry Ellsworth Lay, or Elsie, short for Ellsworth, Elsie Lay. So Butch Cassidy and Elsie Lay started hanging around again at the Hole in the Wall and Robber's Roost, and started to meet a lot of people. Met a lot of outlaws, young outlaws, who were passing, coming and going through that area. So they got some fellas that they had kind of clicked with, and they decided to start a gang, and to call that gang the Wild Bunch, in honor of the Wild Bunch from down in Oklahoma that had, like I said, just been brought to heel. Let's look at the central core members of the Wild Bunch, version 2. These were some of the ones that were perhaps most prominent. Actually, these are the ones that started it off right here that we're looking at right now, other than Harry Tracy. Others would kind of come and go, sometimes only for a job or two, and there's going to be a very significant addition not long after the gang is formed. But for now, we've got Butch Cassidy and his friend Elsie Lay. We also have George Curry, known as Flatnose Curry. We've got Harvey Logan, who had a younger brother, Lonnie, that also associated with the gang. Logan had a relationship with George Curry similar to Butch Cassidy with Mike Cassidy, which is that he learned the ropes from him. And so in honor of his friend Flatnose Curry, Harvey Logan started referring to himself as Kid Curry. You also had Ben Kilpatrick, the tall Texan. You maybe kind of sort of had Harry Tracy. He was frequently crossing paths with the group. I don't know there's any evidence for sure that he did go on any jobs with them, but I don't know there's any evidence that he didn't. And then there was Will Carver, known as News Carver, because he loved to be in the news. Kid Curry didn't love to be in the news as much as Carver did, but he wound up being in the news more because he was the person in this version of the Wild Bunch that was regarded as having a temper, being a little too quick on the trigger. In fact, over the next few years, 4 or 5 years, he would kill 9 lawmen and 2 other people at the very least. So there's your principal group. And you also have another individual who, like Harry Tracy, wasn't exactly a member of the gang per se, but was in the same orbit. And that was Tom Blackjack Ketchum. Blackjack Ketchum had a younger brother named Sam Ketchum, by the way. He had his own gang that operated out of the same hideouts, and a lot of times the people that rode with the Wild Bunch had previously been in Blackjack Ketchum's gang, and sometimes still were. Sometimes you had a situation where even some of these folks would, from time to time, ride with Blackjack on a job when there were no jobs there with the regular Wild Bunch. Now, what the Wild Bunch would do is after a bank or a train robbery, they would all split up and then they would meet together at an agreed upon place, one of their 3 spots to meet up, their 3 safe spots, if you will. And that was the Hole in the Wall in Wyoming and Johnson County, and the Robbers Roost in Utah, and there was a brothel in San Antonio that they all knew. From the very beginning, there were also several specific women that could be seen around the hideouts in Robbers Roost and Hole in the Wall or wherever else they might be operating from. You had from the very beginning Ann and Josie Bassett, who were, by the way, she was sometimes known as Queen Anne. She was the older sister. They were the girlfriends of Butch Cassidy and Elsie Lay at the time the gang was formed. And they wound up being in relationships with some of the other members of the gang. So who was in a relationship with who? It's kind of like Facebook says. It's complicated. It's sort of like it was almost like a soap opera there in the old Robbers Roost. Josie Bassett eventually wound up with News Carver. Della Moore was a prostitute when she met Harvey Logan, when she was probably in her late teens, around 1898. But then she gave up that life to follow him around the West and to hide him when he needed hiding, to resupply him. That's what they were all doing, with the exception of Laura Bullion, who was briefly, I think, in a relationship with Carver, but wound up in a long-term relationship with Ben Kilpatrick. There was something different about her from the other ladies, here in the picture at least, and that is that, unlike them, she would also strap on a gun and put on a mask when they were wearing masks or whatever, and ride along and participate in the robberies. She was a bank robber. She was one of the founding members of the Wild Bunch. And this photograph is actually from her mugshot when she got arrested. Not too long after the Wild Bunch was founded, they got a new recruit. This guy, the Sundance Kid, alias Harry Longabaugh. He was from Pennsylvania originally. He was 1 year younger than Butch Cassidy. He had come west in a wagon train, on a covered wagon, when he was a teenager with his cousin and his family. And when he was 19, had started working as a cowboy, just sort of drifting from ranch to ranch, getting work. He started working as a cowboy when, like I said, when he was 19, which was 1886. If you've been paying attention to the previous lectures, you'll know that 1886 was a bad year to start being a cowboy because of the big blizzards, right, that wiped out so many cattle and also wiped out Harry Longabow's job. So he wound up drifting even more so, and from time to time was known to steal a horse. But for the most part, he was working as a cowboy for several years, including for a while even up in Canada. He was involved possibly in a train robbery in 1892, and also was arrested in Wyoming for at the town of Sundance, Wyoming, having stolen a horse from a cowboy. And he was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in jail for what he did in Sundance. So he started calling himself the Sundance Kid. 1897, he was involved in his first bank robbery with 5 accomplices, and so he wound up passing through the hole in the wall, kind of met up with Harvey Logan, and the two of them did a couple of things, and before you know it, he was in the gang. Butch Cassidy particularly wanted him in the gang because the Sundance Kid was reportedly very good with a gun. He was reportedly very accurate and just very capable, which is almost ironic because during the whole time that he was with the Wild Bunch, which the Wild Bunch itself lasted until 1901, he never killed anybody, which is not to say he didn't kill somebody later, but we'll get to that. Anyway, so the Sundance Kid is now a member, and within a couple of years, he's going to pick up a girlfriend named Etta Place, who is going to become a familiar face among the Wild Bunch as well, and she's going to become way more famous than any of those other ladies that we just looked at recently. Much like the original Wild Bunch, this Wild Bunch was riding high for a couple of years after they were founded, and they seemed unstoppable, just hitting banks and trains left and right. And like the original Wild Bunch, after a couple of years, things started to unravel. And they started unraveling a little bit slowly, and then it all came apart pretty quickly. For example, in 1899, Elsie Lay was arrested and tried and sentenced to life in prison. So that's a big setback. Essentially, even though people talk about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, it was Butch Cassidy and Elsie Lay who started and initially led this gang. So Elsie Lay is out of the picture. Harvey Logan's kid brother Lonnie got killed early in 1900, but even before that, Tom Blackjack Ketchum got arrested. He it was a tragic comedy of errors. His brother Sam and his gang had held up a train, and Tom didn't know they had held up that train. So he shows up with his gang shortly afterward using the same trick to try to get on board the train. And guess what? They were ready for it this time, and he wound up getting shot in the arm, and he was arrested and he was sentenced to hang. So that's 1899. Then in early 1900, Harvey Logan's kid brother got killed, like I said. George Curry, Flat-Nosed Curry, got killed by a sheriff and his deputy, which at this point, Kid Curry, who was not, I guess you could say he was not wound that tight to begin with, or maybe he was wound too tight, tracked down that sheriff and that deputy and killed them both dead. So here you've got now their kind of friend and occasional ally, Blackjack Ketchum, in prison awaiting to be hanged. You've got Elsie Lay in prison, and you have Harvey Logan's brother and his mentor, George Curry, now dead. Now, Elzie Lay had an interesting end to his story. He served just a few years in prison, and then there was a situation in the prison where some prisoners attempting to escape took the warden's wife and kid hostage, and Elzie Lay rescued them, and that got him that got him paroled. He had a life sentence, and he served like 5 years, and he went straight after that, and you didn't hear anything much about him, and nothing about him getting arrested afterwards. Meanwhile, Black Jack Ketchum met his date with the hangman in a most gruesome way. You know, I don't know if you've ever watched old movies where you've got the hangman who comes and he's got his tape measure and he's got his weights and he's making sure everything is just right, you know, and he measures the prisoner and gets the ropes arranged just. There's a reason they do that, you know, because these hangings can go wrong, and in this case it did. The rope they used was too long, so it didn't. When the trap door was sprung and he dropped down to eternity, instead of it being a short drop that stopped suddenly and broke his neck, which is what usually happens, he went down a little bit further, gathering more momentum, and it didn't just snap his neck; it ripped his head completely off. So that's not something that you want to see before breakfast. So that was the end of Black Jack Ketchum. So here we see some of the threads starting to come apart. Then, later in 1900, several members of the Wild Bunch were in Texas, and they went into Fort Worth and had this picture taken that we saw a few minutes ago. Seemed like a fun idea at the time. They got all dressed up and took a group photo and looked quite dashing. And there was just one big problem with this, and that is the fact that the Pinkerton agents had been trying to catch them for some time with no success, and part of the reason they'd had very little success was because they didn't have any recent pictures of many of them. Some of them they had no pictures at all, but now, hey, look, we got a group picture of all of them, and these were put on wanted posters and were distributed all around the country, and the Pinkertons really were able to step up their efforts to run the Wild Bunch to ground. And that brings us back yet again to this guy, Charlie Siringo. We've met him in a couple of our lectures already. Charlie Siringo, Pinkerton detective. He had started off as a cowboy and had, driven herds up into Dodge City, where he met Bat Masterson. Later, he became friends with Pat Garrett, and then in the 1880s began a long career as a Pinkerton agent. And in that capacity, he broke up strikes, but he also broke up rustling rings. He also chased train robbers. And one of his specialties was going undercover, assuming a new identity, sometimes for long periods of time, trying to get close to his quarry. And he had been trying to get close to the Wild Bunch at this point for 2 or 3 years with very little success and much frustration. So this picture helped. Something that also helped was a little bit of news that he picked up from an old friend of his, this guy, Tom Horn, who was able to give Siringo some information about the location of Kid Curry. So let's talk about Tom Horn a little bit. Fascinating individual. As a teenager, he had started working as a cavalry scout under Al Siebers. Remember way back when we talked about the Apache Kid, however long ago that was in this lecture? Al Siebers, chief of scouts. Tom Horn, by the mid-1880s, had become chief of scouts for the Apache Wars. Chief of scouts and also interpreter. He helped in the efforts to defeat Geronimo and served as an interpreter with Geronimo when he surrendered. After that, he got worked various places. He wound up being essentially a hired gun. He was a Pinkerton agent as well for a pretty good while. And during the time that he was a Pinkerton agent, he was involved in the Johnson County War, working on behalf of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And it's believed that he may be one of the people who killed Nate Champion in that attack. He may also have killed the black cowboy Isom Dart. He got fired from the Pinkertons because he was accused of killing a couple of law officers as well. So after that, he was more of a free agent, if you will, although he pretty much was one all along. And so he continued working as a gunman and as an enforcer for various cattle barons. But he maintained his friendship with Charlie Siringo, that he knew was after the Wild Bunch. So he passed on this information. We're going to check back in on Tom Horn in just a few minutes and see what became of him after all this. But for now, let's talk some more about Charlie Siringo and the Pinkertons. They were now hot on the trail of the Wild Bunch, and every time it seemed that Butch Cassidy and his gang turned around, there were more Pinkertons pressing at them, and they started to feel very desperate. Wild Bunch associate Harry Tracy had actually been captured in 1898 and escaped. Then he got captured again in 1901, sent to prison, and broke out again, this time killing 3 guards and 3 civilians. There was a massive manhunt in Washington State for him. He took a family hostage, had another shootout, killed a couple of more police officers, and then finally killed himself rather than be captured after he had been seriously wounded several times. So that puts Harry Tracy out of the picture. Butch Cassidy was getting more and more nervous. The Pinkertons were now nosing around his hometown in Utah and looking for leads on him. So he and the Sundance Kid and Etta Place decided to remove themselves from the equation and leave the country, which they did in February 1901. We will catch back up with them in just a little bit. 1901, not a good year in general for the rest of the Wild Bunch. In April, News Carver was killed. Actually, he was killed in a bakery in Sonora, Texas, by a posse who burst in to arrest him for the murder of a deputy sheriff that had actually been killed, no surprise, by Kid Curry. Carver started to draw his gun and was shot 6 times, and that was the end of him. I don't think he even got his donuts. Then, in November of that year, 1901, Ben Kilpatrick, the tall Texan, and his girlfriend Laura Bullion were both arrested. Kilpatrick managed to stay alive for a while, served several years in prison, got out in 1910, and immediately went back to robbing trains and got killed in a shootout not too long after that, within a few years. And back in October of 1901, Kid Curry's girlfriend Della Moore got arrested in Nashville for passing marked bills from a previous robbery. A couple of months later, he got into a gunfight with cops in Knoxville and killed a couple. Managed to escape from that scrape. Went up to Montana and killed the rancher who had killed his kid brother some time back, and for some reason came back to Knoxville. whereupon he was arrested after a monumental brawl with cops. He was finally subdued, and he was sent to prison, sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, but he escaped within 6 months and managed to stay free for about a year after that. And then finally, at the end of about almost exactly a year after his escape, I think this is around 1904, he'd put together a new gang, robbed another train, and a posse got the drop on them, and he got shot to pieces. And much like Harry Tracy shot himself rather than be captured, not able to keep fighting because of his injuries. So essentially, you take a look at all of this. The only person who came out of it was, other than the ladies, was Elsie Lay. Um, Being in a gang called the Wild Bunch was not really healthy for you. Meanwhile, though, Butch and Sundance and Etta had left the United States behind them and gone to South America in 1901, down to Argentina, where they had a little ranch. Actually, it wasn't even that little a ranch. They bought a lot of cattle. They had a whole lot of sheep, and apparently, for a few years at least, lived a rather idyllic life. Just the three of them. Here's a picture from, I think, around 1902, 1903 that they sent home to family. But eventually, Butch and Sundance I don't know if they got behind on the bills or if they got bored, but they pulled another robbery and wound up having to flee up into the Andes Mountains. And then they were in Chile for a while. And then finally, after several years of living there, Etta Place got tired of living on the run. So she left them and went back to the United States, went to San Francisco. So after that, it was just the two of them, and they had moved to Bolivia and returned to their robbing ways. Now, turns out that two Norte Americano bank robbers kind of stand out in South America. So they were identified fairly easily, and the Bolivian authorities tracked them down to this adobe house that they were renting and attacked them. And it resulted in an all day long and way into the night gunfight, which finally ended at 2 o'clock in the morning when the Bolivian police reported having heard a loud shout or two and then two gunshots. And then they stormed the house to find the two outlaws dead, shot to pieces, multiple bullet wounds, and each of them with a final bullet wound to the head. They speculated that Butch Cassidy had put his partner out of his misery and then shot himself. Now, there were stories, and still are stories, that either Butch Cassidy alone survived, actually, or that the both of them survived and faked their death somehow, and came back to the States and lived out a long and happy life. Just like there are the same stories about Jesse James, about Billy the Kid, and about various other romanticized heroes. And those are fun stories, and some of them are pretty interesting, and a few of them make you kind of wonder. But so far as we know, the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid ended in that gunfight there in Bolivia in November of 1908. So well past what we normally maybe associate with the Old West. But by this point, we're not talking about the West, are we? We're talking, well, yeah, we are Western South America. This is how many people my age and older, maybe even people a little bit younger than me, envision Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and particularly their last stand in Bolivia, this final scene from the 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, starring Paul Newman as Butch Cassidy and Robert Redford as the Sundance Kid. This was a I think a really effective and smart way to end such a movie. Uh, Overwhelmed, faced with overwhelming numbers and outgunned and hopeless and wounded, the two outlaws just come charging out, guns blazing, to face a hail of bullets, but the frame of the camera freezes right here so that we don't see them get shot because we've gotten very fond of them over the course of the movie, and that would be very jarring. So it's like they never died. So one can imagine, whatever one wanted to after this freeze frame. A very effective ending. I've always found it fascinating that in the year 1969 there were two movies, essentially, about the Wild Bunch. There was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, about the actual second Wild Bunch, and then there was also a movie called The Wild Bunch, directed by Sam Peckinpah, that was in many ways the complete opposite of this film, although it told a very similar story. But the way it was told was very different. It was a very stark, violent, in some ways almost nihilistic film, but also strangely beautiful. Um, it has no bearing and connection to any of the people we've talked about or any of the Wild Bunch of gangs. It's about a group of old, aging bank robbers in 1913 that are called the Wild Bunch. Just happen to have that same name, and it follows them as they go south of the border, pursued by bounty hunters sent by the railroad, and get embroiled in the military and political turmoil in Mexico at that time period. So almost the exact opposite in tone. The ending is the same. Everybody gets wiped out by uh, Latino military forces. But in the Wild Bunch, they show it. They not only show it, they show it in graphic detail. Sam Peckinpah was known for that. Um, and yet, same basic theme, same basic story, and two classic westerns, two of the best western films ever made. Well, let's get back to Tom Horn. Remember, Tom Horn was a former scout for the cavalry, a former Pinkerton agent, former cowboy, and a long time by this time hired gun that frequently worked for ranchers, worked for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, worked for cattle barons. In the summer of 1901 in Wyoming, there was a group of ranchers who were upset about a sheep farmer in the area. And Tom Horn was seen talking with some of these ranchers. And several things started happening after that. Intimidation tactics against the sheep farmers to try to encourage the family to move away. And then one evening in August, the father of this sheep farming family, the Nickel family, um, loaned his 14-year-old son his coat to go out in the rain to check on something, and he was shot dead from a distance. So the idea was that he had been mistakenly confused for his father because he was wearing his coat. Now, Tom Horn was in a saloon drinking not long after that, and then after he was drinking, he was contacted about applying for a job with I think with the sheriff's office, and he was still inebriated. And some leading questions were asked to get him to talk about the Nickel family, this sheep herding family, and according to the deputy Joe LaFlores, Horn confessed while drunk to the to the murder, and he was arrested. And there was a trial, and there was a good bit of controversy as to whether or not a drunken confession should count. And there was also some feeling, and there still is in some quarters, that Tom Horn was railroaded so to speak, to keep him quiet. He never did say who had hired him or what specifically they had actually hired him to do. I think the general consensus, however, among historians is that, yeah, he did it, and he made a big mistake, and that was the end of the line or the end of the rope for him. There was a movie made about Tom Horn in 1980, one of the final movies made by the great Steve McQueen. That's very much worth watching. That gives you an idea about the life of this figure, Tom Horn, who it's kind of interesting that I'm wrapping up this lecture with him. It comes chronologically, but he's kind of a lawman, but not really. And he's kind of an outlaw, but not exactly. And kind of a gunfighter. And kind of, he, fits in with the Indian Wars as well. So anyway, this has been a long and circuitous road, this particular lecture, and we've covered a lot of territory. Now, next time we're going to sort of wrap up the 19th century.